Back in 1996, a German exchange student was found guilty in the disappearance of a fellow university student from his hall's residence. Refusing to accept her son's guilt, his mother investigated the crime herself and discovered, to her horror, that the old student house itself had answers, and they were a lot more horrifying than anyone could ever imagine. This was a story that was as strange as it was terrifying, and shook the local community up at the time, with its impact still felt today. An 18-year-old student studying at the University of Huddersfield, named Jess Palmer, went to a student union on a cold, wintry Saturday night and hooked up with a fellow student, a German by the name of Hans Matthias, who was on a year exchange from Dusseldorf University. They had drinks in the bar and then went on to a nightclub in town called Mirage, where they drank and danced until nearly 2 a.m. They then jumped in a cab and went back to Hans's Hall's residence, Millfield House, an old converted mill house dating back 150 years. They had sex and then passed out. In the morning, Hans woke to an empty bed. Jess had left.
Initially, I was a bit surprised that she'd just left without saying anything, but also that must have been so out of it that I didn't hear her leave. We seemed to get on well and we had fun, you know, so it was just a bit strange. But I never gave her much thought after that. That was until the police knocked on my door the following Monday morning.
Jess Palmer never made it back to her shared student house on the Sunday morning, nor was she seen by anyone else on that morning during what would have been the 2-mile journey back to her home. Her housemates reported her missing on that evening, and with the subsequent police investigation, CCTV and eyewitness statements, it was revealed that Hans was the last person to have been with her.
I was really shocked when they told me that she was missing, but then I was in utter disbelief when I realised that they thought it was I had something to do with her disappearance.
The police took Hans in for questioning, whilst officers searched his bedroom for any evidence of foul play. They found no evidence of a struggle. However, they did find, stuffed up in the inside of an old fireplace, Jess's bag, the one she'd taken out with her the night before, which still had in it her purse, a small bag of makeup, her student ID, and most alarming, her house keys, something she would never have left that room without. Hans was arrested on suspicion of murder.
I just couldn't believe it. I was just in shock. I just wanted the ground to open up and swallow me whole. I couldn't explain where she went or how her bag ended up where it did, but I certainly didn't have anything to do with it.
Millfield House, the Hall's residence where Hans lived, was unusual for a student accommodation. It was out of town, approximately 2.5 miles from the university campus, away from other student accommodation, and surrounded by a residential estate. It was also an old Victorian mansion that would have belonged to the wealthy mill owners and their staff some 150 years previous, but now converted to house 20+ students. The rooms were those huge Victorian rooms with high ceilings, wide sash windows, and most with their own large fireplaces, and as one student resident put it, it was always alive with loud creaks and the incessant banging of pipes. In fact, many past residents of Millfield House remarked on the many strange goings-on in it, including strange sights and sounds, as well as personal items and food going missing.
I know this sounds daft, but that house did have its own energy, and not a very nice one. I knew Hans. He lived on the ground floor the year I was there. He seemed really fun and smart. And I know you never really know someone, especially when you're thrown into a house showing them, but I could just tell you he wasn't responsible for this horrific thing. But at the same time, I also wasn't surprised that something like this happened in our house. Do you understand? I lived at the top of the 4th floor, room 22. There were a few other bedrooms on that level, and then a locked door at the end of the corridor. But there was always a strange feeling up there, like I was being watched. And it was super creepy. But there were two incidents in particular that really freaked me out completely. The first was when I awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of an old man chattering in his weird accent. He was speaking English, I think, but it was like an old type of English, using old words that I'd only read in old novels. And it didn't sound like it was coming from outside. It sounded really close, really close. So I got up and followed the sound. And when I think back now, this just seems crazy, but I guess I was just on autopilot. Anyway, I end up on the landing and sure enough, the voice is coming from behind the boiler cupboard door at the end of the corridor. I can't explain to you how odd the voice and language was. It was familiar, and yet it was like nothing I'd heard before. Anyway, I kind of just stood there, really close to the door, listening to this weird conversation going on, and then suddenly it just stopped. And then I just got really scared that whoever it was and knew I was there on the other side of the door, and I just ran to my room and locked my door. But creepier than that was the night, a few weeks after that incident, when I woke to this really cold feeling come over me. And in the dark corner of my room, I just saw this large figure of a man standing there. Oh God, I just gives me shivers thinking about it now. It was too dark to make out any features, but he was just stood watching me silently. I did what to do. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just froze completely. And then after what seemed like an age, he just stepped back into the shadows until I couldn't see him. I somehow managed to find the Kosh Tun Balai and, well, he just wasn't there anymore. He just disappeared.
Leanne had thought afterwards that she could have been half asleep and perhaps imagined the apparition, but others in the house had witnessed similar sightings, and reluctantly she'd started to believe that the old manor house was actually haunted.
I never believed in ghosts. I'm a natural cynic at heart, but I can't rationally explain the things I'd seen and heard, and nor could anyone else in my house for that matter.
Despite her body not being found, Hans was tried and found guilty in the disappearance and murder of Jess Palmer a year later in 1997. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Due to the crime and its morbid nature, Millfield House was closed as student accommodation at the end of that school year and sold to developers for the land. That could have been the end of the story, but like Leanne, Hans's mother Hilde not only vehemently believed in her son's innocence, but also later discovered that the house itself had answers. Devastated by her son's conviction, Hilde moved temporarily to Yorkshire from Dusseldorf to be closer to where her son was in prison, and whilst there, did her own investigating in an attempt to prove her son's innocence.
I'd met with Leanne and a few of the other students who had shared the house with Hans. It quickly became clear that they thought the same as me, that Hans was not capable of such a crime. They were all in agreement that he was a lovely, smart boy, and it just didn't make sense. There was no evidence of a crime. In the bedroom, as went a hidden purse. The police searched the whole house and found nothing. Yet here he was, found guilty of a murder.
It also became clear to Hilde that many of Hans's housemates believed the house to be haunted, with shared sightings of unusual activity. This led Hilde to the city library, where she researched the house. She went through hundreds of old newspapers and microfilm, using an old, dog-eared English to German book of translation to help her. It seemed an impossible task, but after weeks and then months of visiting the library, every day, she found something.
I didn't know what I was in hope to find, to be honest. It was just all these conversations about the bad energy from the house. So I began looking at the most recent stories relating to the house and its student occupants. As the first thing I saw was 3 years before Jess's disappearance. Another girl had gone missing from Millfield House. She'd actually been a student there, albeit not frequently, not very often. So her disappearance was not actually flagged until the end of that school year. but they never found her and no clues were ever given to her whereabouts, although it was assumed that she'd run away. This was 3 years before, and to this day, that girl is still down as a runaway.
But the further Hilda dug, the more she uncovered. There was the disappearance of another student resident, Melissa Holder, only a year before that in 1992. It was believed she went missing in town, not returning home after a late lecture. She was last seen on CCTV footage leaving the university campus, but then no further trace of her could be found.
Now, Melissa Holden's was an unusual case. It was assumed at the time that she disappeared in town, hence the police investigation being focused around there and not on Millfield House, where she lived as a student. There was no bus footage of her, nor did any bus driver record seeing her. But then I thought to myself, what if she did go back to Millfield House that night? Not by bus, but she walks the 2.5 miles back. She gets in, but it's late. It's after 9. Her housemates are either out or in their rooms studying. They don't hear her return. She goes straight to her room, which happened to be the same room Han stayed in those years later, and she just falls asleep exhausted. And it is there that she gets taken from, just like Jess.
She came across other disappearances of young women, some from the local area, and 1 or 2 more who were loosely connected to Millfield House. But there was definitely a pattern. Too many to be a coincidence, although they did seem to span several decades. When she researched even further back, she discovered, to her horror, that there had been an awful tragedy back in 1883. The mill owners, named the Braithwaites, had lived in the house with their staff, which included the married cooks and the cook's son Jacob, as well as 3 maids. The Braithwaites had a teenage daughter, Rose, who the chef's son Jacob had a supposed infatuation with, often being caught in the master's quarters, specifically Rose's room. The Braithwaites, furious with this intrusion and his disregard of the strict class system at the time, which meant the children of staff should never mix with the master's family, sacked Jacob's parents. At this period in time, this would have meant the family being ostracised from the community, and inevitably destitution. Jacob, feeling his parents had been unjustly punished, grabbed one of his father's knives, entered the family area of the house, and stabbed Mr. Braithwaite to death whilst he slept. He then kidnapped Rose and ran off with her. The whereabouts of Rose and Jacob was never discovered, and Millfield House was soon abandoned by the mourning Mrs. Braithwaite, left to decay in the callous hands of time. It changed ownership several times over the years, from a retreat for visiting Catholic priests to the area, to accommodation for soldiers training in the Yorkshire Dales during the Second World War, before eventually being bought by the university in the 1960s. After reading all these stories, Hilda became convinced that the house somehow had answers, and so she visited Millfield House for herself. It was now boarded up and abandoned, but what she discovered inside that house was way worse than anything she could possibly have imagined.
I travelled up to it just as night fell, so not to be seen. I was scared of being arrested for trespass, I suppose. It was strange seeing it up close in real life. It was this huge, dark, grey brick mansion on top of this small hill, again to this long drive. The wind had picked up that night, and it seemed to whistle through the cracks and openings of the house, echoing loudly through its horrors, as if the house was making the sound itself. It was so very creepy. But I managed to climb in through a gap where one of the boards had come away from a downstairs window. I had a torch and just went from room to room, the wind whistling louder at me as if warning me away. It seemed even bigger on the inside. The ceiling seemed to go on and to so many rooms, some littered with books and sheets of old paper, evidence of students that once called Millfield House home. I eventually found Hans's room, number 5, as the back of the ground floor. It was a room still with police tape up, or a bit worn, and it hung loose. Another victim of time, I suppose. Inside the room was dark and mostly empty except for a bed and a few of... This where you got me. I'm sorry. But it was 100 old photographs stood stuck above his bed. Photos of us, me, his father, his sister, back in Dusseldorf. Photos from a happier and more innocent time. I just fell to the bed and I cried my eyes out for what could have been hours. I just remember thinking, what was the point of me being there? It was so painful, yet so futile, but then the strangest thing happened.